The ink was still wet on the document when Brandon smiled at me across the dinner table, his expression radiating triumph. He believed he had just secured his future, that the paper he'd signed moments ago guaranteed him half of everything I owned. My restored craftsman home in Hyde Park. My vintage Mercedes. My thriving marketing agency. What he didn't know was that the elegant folder I'd presented to him didn't contain a deed transfer or joint ownership agreement. It was a prenuptial agreement so ironclad that his lawyer would later call it a masterpiece of asset protection. By the time he discovered the truth, it would be too late. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this all began, to the moment I first realized the man I planned to marry saw me as nothing more than a profitable investment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The first crack in my perfect engagement appeared on a Wednesday afternoon in March. I was working from home, reviewing campaign proposals for a new client when Brandon's voice drifted through the partially open door of my study. He was on his phone, pacing in the hallway with that particular tone he used when he thought I wasn't listening. The tone that was just a shade too casual, rehearsed in a way that made my instincts prickle with unease. I should mention that my home office occupied what was once the sunroom of my 1920s craftsman house, a space I'd spent 2 years carefully restoring. Every detail had been my choice, from the original hardwood floors I'd refinished myself to the custom built-in bookshelves that housed both my design books and my growing collection of vintage cameras. This house was my sanctuary, purchased with money I'd saved since I was 16, renovated with my own vision and sweat. It represented every sacrifice I'd made, every client I'd courted, every weekend I'd spent covered in paint and plaster dust instead of going out with friends. Brandon's voice grew slightly louder, and I found myself closing my laptop, abandoning any pretense of work to listen more carefully. I'm not proud of eavesdropping, but something in his tone triggered an alarm I couldn't ignore. Yeah, it's all coming together perfectly. The voice carried a smugness that made my stomach tighten. She has no idea I've been talking to that property developer about the Hyde Park location. Once we're married and I get my name on the deed, we can push for the sale. This neighborhood is prime for commercial development. The house alone should net us close to $800,000, maybe more. The words landed like physical blows. Us. We. As if my house, my investment, my home was already a joint asset to be liquidated at his convenience. I sat frozen, my hand pressed against my mouth to keep from making a sound that would alert him to my presence. Natalie's already drawn up the LLC paperwork, Brandon continued, his footsteps moving toward the kitchen. We'll funnel the sale through the company, minimize the tax impact. Victoria's so focused on her little marketing projects that she won't even notice the paperwork I'm having her sign. She trusts me completely. The casual dismissal of my work, my career, my agency that employed 12 people and had just landed a 6-figure contract with a major tech company stung almost as much as the revelation of his scheme. My little marketing projects. As if the business I'd built from nothing was merely a hobby to humor me while he planned to dismantle my life for profit. I heard him laugh, a sound I'd once found charming but now recognized as calculated and cold. Her father already thinks she's incapable of managing real assets. He practically told me at Christmas that she needs someone to handle the business side of things. Once we're married, it'll be easy to convince her that selling makes sense. We'll tell her we want to buy something bigger together, something more suited for a family. She'll eat that up. The mention of my father sent a fresh wave of anger through me. Richard Hayes had never hidden his disappointment that I'd chosen marketing over joining his commercial real estate firm. Our relationship had been strained since I was 22 and turned down his offer to work under him, choosing instead to build my own path. But I'd never imagined he'd been planting seeds of doubt about my capabilities to my own fiancé. I need to go, Brandon said abruptly. She's working from home today and I don't want her overhearing anything. I'll call you tonight after she goes to bed. We can finalize the timeline then. The call ended and I heard him move into the kitchen, the sound of the refrigerator opening, the clink of a beer bottle. Normal sounds of my fiancé making himself at home in my house. Except nothing was normal anymore. Everything I thought I knew had shattered in the space of a 5-minute phone call. I sat in my study for another 20 minutes, my mind racing through memories and moments with new clarity. The way Brandon had suggested I add him to my bank accounts for convenience sake. How he'd offered to handle my property taxes last year, saying I had too much on my plate. His insistence that we get married quickly, within 6 months of his proposal, because life was short and why wait? Every suggestion, every helpful offer, every gentle piece of advice now revealed itself as part of a larger strategy. We'd met 18 months ago at a networking event for Austin entrepreneurs. Brandon had presented himself as a consultant helping small businesses scale their operations. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in my work. Our relationship progressed quickly, perhaps too quickly in retrospect. Within 6 months we were exclusive. Within a year he'd proposed at a restaurant overlooking Lady Bird Lake, getting down on one knee while a violinist played and other diners applauded. I'd been swept up in the romance of it all, ignoring small warning signs that now seemed glaringly obvious. The way he always steered conversations toward my assets rather than my aspirations. How he'd befriend my father, taking him to golf outings and business lunches, positioning himself as the responsible future son-in-law. His suggestion that we live in my house rather than finding a place together, framed as practicality but clearly strategic positioning. When Brandon called out asking if I wanted to order dinner, I somehow managed to respond normally, my voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside me. I told him I wasn't hungry, that I had a deadline to meet. He didn't press, likely relieved to have the evening to continue his scheming without my presence. That night, after Brandon finally went to bed, I sat in my darkened living room with my laptop, beginning the research that would become my salvation. I started with Natalie Ross, the name he'd mentioned on the phone. It took less than 15 minutes to discover she wasn't just a business associate. Natalie was Brandon's ex-girlfriend, a real estate attorney who specialized in property development and LLC formations. Their relationship had ended 2 years ago, at least publicly, but their business partnership had clearly continued. I found their joint LLC, registered 6 months before Brandon and I even met. N.R. Cooper Developments. The filing listed several properties they'd acquired, renovated, and flipped for substantial profits. It was a proven system, and apparently I was meant to be their next project. The personal relationship might have ended, but the profitable partnership was alive and well, with me cast as their unwitting benefactor. The next morning I called in sick to my own company, something I'd never done in the 5 years since I'd founded Hayes Marketing Solutions. My assistant Lauren was concerned, offering to bring soup or reschedule my appointments. I assured her I just needed a day to rest, though rest was the furthest thing from my mind. As soon as Brandon left for what he claimed was a consulting job, I began making calls. My first was to Catherine Wong, a family law attorney whose firm had worked with my marketing agency on their brand refresh. We developed a rapport during that project, and I trusted her discretion. Catherine listened without interruption as I explained the situation, my voice remarkably steady as I recounted Brandon's phone conversation and my subsequent discoveries about his partnership with Natalie Ross. When I finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. "Victoria, I'm going to be direct with you because I think you can handle it. What you've described is a premeditated scheme to defraud you of your assets through marriage. The good news is that Texas is a community property state, which means anything you own before marriage remains yours. The better news is that you're not married yet, which means we have time to protect everything. What do you suggest?" I asked, my pen poised over a notepad where I'd already begun listing my assets and concerns. First, don't let him know you're aware of anything. Continue as normal while we build your protection strategy. Second, I want you to document everything, every conversation about finances, every suggestion he makes about property or assets. Third, we're going to draft a prenuptial agreement that will make it absolutely clear what belongs to you and what, if anything, might be considered marital property. I felt my first glimmer of hope since discovering Brandon's betrayal. But won't he refuse to sign a prenup? Won't that tip him off that I know something? Catherine's laugh was dry and knowing. Men like Brandon have egos that make them sloppy. We'll present the prenup as something else entirely. You mentioned he keeps asking you to sign documents, right? Deeds, account paperwork, all disguised as helpful gestures? I confirmed this, recalling at least 3 occasions where Brandon had presented me with official-looking documents, always with a convenient explanation about tax benefits or estate planning. "Then we'll beat him at his own game," Catherine said with satisfaction evident in her voice. "We'll prepare a comprehensive prenuptial agreement, but we'll present it to him as exactly what he wants. A property transfer document. Joint ownership paperwork. Whatever he thinks he's been working toward. The folder will look official, the language will seem to give him what he wants, but the actual legal effect will be the opposite. It will explicitly protect your premarital assets and establish that he has no claim to anything you acquired before the marriage." The audacity of the plan took my breath away. "You're suggesting we trick him into signing away any claim to my property by making him think he's gaining access to it?" "I'm suggesting we use clear legal language that protects your interests," Catherine corrected, though I could hear the smile in her voice. "If he signs without reading carefully, if he assumes the document says what he wants it to say rather than what it actually states, that's a failure of due diligence on his part. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Any competent attorney would advise their client to read documents before signing. It's not our fault if he's too arrogant to follow that basic principle. Over the next 2 weeks, I lived a double life that was exhausting and surreal. During the day and evening, I was the loving fiancé, discussing wedding plans and exclaiming over cake samples. I let Brandon believe I was completely unaware of his scheming, even going so far as to mention casually that my father had suggested we might want to consider selling the house eventually, to get something with more space for the family we'd presumably start. Brandon's eyes had lit up at that manufactured comment, exactly as I'd predicted. "Really?" He'd tried to sound casual. "What did you say?" "I told him I loved this house but I'd think about it," I replied, watching his expression carefully. "After all, it is just a house. What matters is building our life together." The words tasted like ash, but they served their purpose. Brandon became even more solicitous, more attentive, clearly believing his plan was working perfectly. He stopped being quite so careful about his phone calls with Natalie, often taking them in the next room rather than waiting until I was asleep or out of the house. I documented everything, just as Catherine had instructed, including the LLC paperwork I found in his briefcase one afternoon when he left it in my study. Meanwhile, Catherine and her team worked with meticulous precision to craft the prenuptial agreement that would become Brandon's undoing. The document was a work of art, structured to appear at first glance like a property transfer and joint ownership agreement while actually being an ironclad protection of my premarital assets. The key section, buried in dense legal language that most people would skim over, explicitly stated that all property, assets, and business interests held by Victoria and Hayes prior to the marriage would remain her sole and separate property, with no claim or interest granted to Brandon Michael Cooper by virtue of the marriage or any other arrangement. The document went on to specify my house by address, my vehicle by VIN number, my business by its legal entity name, and even my savings and investment accounts. But the genius was in the framing. The opening paragraphs, the sections most people read before their attention wanders, discuss the couple's mutual desire to clearly establish ownership and property rights. It mentioned fairness and transparency. It used phrases like joint planning and mutual understanding. Someone reading quickly, someone who expected the document to say what they wanted it to say, would see those opening paragraphs and assume the rest followed the same theme. Catherine met with me 3 times to review the document, ensuring I understood every clause and provision. We also prepared for Brandon's potential objections or questions, though Catherine believed his ego and overconfidence would prevent him from scrutinizing the agreement too closely. "He thinks he's the smartest person in the room," Catherine observed during our final preparation meeting. "Men like that rarely imagine they could be outmaneuvered, especially by women they've already dismissed as naive or manageable. He'll see what he expects to see." The plan was to present the prenup during a romantic dinner at home, framed as my gesture of commitment and trust. Catherine advised me to let Brandon feel like he was guiding me through the process, to appeal to his ego by asking him to explain the document to me, to make him feel clever and in control even as he signed away any claim to my assets. The night I chose was a Friday in late April, exactly 2 months before our scheduled wedding date. I'd prepared Brandon's favorite meal, opened an expensive bottle of wine, and set the table with candles and the good china. The prenup sat in an elegant leather folder on the sideboard, looking official and important. Brandon arrived home to find me in the kitchen, wearing the blue dress he'd once said made my eyes look incredible. His smile was warm and genuine, or at least it would have seemed that way if I didn't know the truth of his intentions. He kissed my cheek, commented on how good everything smelled, and asked what the occasion was. I wanted to do something special, I said, gesturing for him to sit. We're getting married in 2 months and I've been thinking about our future, about making sure we're set up for success. His attention sharpened immediately, like a predator catching the scent of prey. That's great, honey. What did you have in mind? Over dinner, I carefully steered the conversation toward finances and property, letting Brandon think he was the one guiding the discussion. I mentioned concerns about protecting our assets, about making sure everything was properly structured. I even referenced conversations with my father, knowing that would lend credibility to my sudden interest in legal documentation. Actually, I've been talking to a lawyer, I said as I cleared the dinner plates, my tone casual. About getting our affairs in order before the wedding. My dad suggested it was the responsible thing to do. Brandon's expression flickered with surprise and something else, calculation perhaps, before settling into supportive interest. That's very mature of you. What kind of documentation are we talking about? I retrieved the leather folder from the sideboard and placed it in front of him. Just some paperwork to make sure everything's clearly established. Property ownership, asset management, that kind of thing. The lawyer said it's standard for people with real estate and business interests. Brandon opened the folder, his eyes scanning the first page of the document. The header read Property and Asset Management Agreement in bold letters, with our names listed as parties. I watched him read the opening paragraphs, saw the moment he decided he understood what he was looking at. This looks good, he said, though I noticed he was flipping pages without really reading them, the way people do when they believe they already know the content. Very thorough. Your lawyer did a nice job with this. I'd prepared myself for this moment, coached by Catherine on how to appear uncertain and deferential. Do you think I should sign it? I asked, letting a note of hesitation enter my voice. I want to make sure we're doing the right thing. Brandon reached across the table and took my hand, his expression radiating false sincerity. Absolutely. This protects both of us and makes sure everything's clear going forward. It's exactly what we need. He pulled a pen from his pocket, the expensive one I'd given him for his birthday, and I watched as he signed his name on the designated line with a flourish. Then he pushed the document toward me, and I signed my own name, my hand remarkably steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. There, Brandon said with satisfaction, closing the folder. All official. Now we can focus on the wedding and our future together. I smiled and raised my wine glass in a toast, playing my part perfectly while inside I felt a fierce satisfaction. Brandon believed he'd just secured his claim to my property. In reality, he'd signed a legal document that explicitly denied him any such claim, that protected everything I'd built, that would leave him with nothing if this relationship ended. Catherine had included one final masterstroke in the agreement. A clause that stated if either party attempted to void or challenge the agreement, they would be responsible for all legal fees incurred by both parties, plus a penalty equal to 10% of the protected asset's value. If Brandon ever tried to fight the prenup, it would cost him not just his lawyer's fees but mine as well, plus a 6-figure penalty he could never afford. The document was filed with the county clerk the following Monday, officially recorded and legally binding. Catherine called me that afternoon to confirm everything was in order, her voice warm with approval. You did well, Victoria. Whatever happens next, your assets are protected. He can't touch your house, your car, your business, or any of your premarital accounts. You've secured your foundation. But even as she spoke, I knew something had shifted inside me. The woman who had signed that prenup wasn't the same person who had overheard that phone call 6 weeks ago. That woman had been trusting, perhaps naively so, willing to see the best in people even when evidence suggested otherwise. This new version of myself was harder, more calculating, and absolutely unwilling to marry a man who saw me as a business opportunity rather than a life partner. The question wasn't whether I would marry Brandon. That decision had been made the moment I discovered his betrayal. The question was how and when to end things, and whether I wanted to confront him with what I knew or simply walk away. That decision would be made for me sooner than I expected, in a way I could never have anticipated. The unraveling began 3 days after Brandon signed the prenuptial agreement, though I didn't recognize it immediately. I was at my office downtown, leading a strategy session with my creative team about a campaign launch for a sustainable fashion brand, when my phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who lived 2 houses down from mine. "Victoria, there's a man with a clipboard taking photos of your house. He's been walking around the property for 20 minutes. Should I be concerned?" My stomach dropped even as I maintained my composure in front of my team. I excused myself, stepping into my private office to call Mrs. Chen back. She answered on the first ring, her voice carrying the sharp alertness of someone who'd lived through enough to recognize when something wasn't right. "He's still there," she reported. "Now he's measuring something near your driveway. He has one of those will measuring tools." I asked him what he was doing and he said he was conducting a property assessment. Seemed surprised anyone was questioning him. I thanked Mrs. Chen and told her I'd handle it, then immediately called Catherine Wong. She answered despite being in court, stepping out briefly when I explained the situation. "He's moving faster than we anticipated," Catherine said, her voice tight with concern. A property assessment usually means someone's preparing for a sale or refinancing. He's likely getting documentation ready to present to potential buyers or developers. The question is whether he plans to wait until after the wedding or if he's arrogant enough to try something sooner. "What can I do?" I asked, watching through my office window as people moved along the street below, going about their normal days while mine tilted further off balance. "Document everything. Get copies of whatever that assessor files. And Victoria," Catherine paused, her next words careful, "you need to consider accelerating your timeline. If Brandon realizes you're onto him, if he discovers what that prenup actually says, he could become unpredictable. Men who feel cornered can be dangerous." Her warning settled over me like a cold blanket. I'd been so focused on the legal and financial aspects of Brandon's betrayal that I hadn't fully considered the emotional volatility of confronting him. What if his response wasn't just anger but something worse? That evening, Brandon came home late, his mood ebullient in a way that immediately put me on alert. He kissed me more enthusiastically than usual, poured us both wine without being asked, and suggested we look at honeymoon destinations on his laptop. "I've been thinking," he said as we sat on the couch, his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that once would have felt comforting but now felt suffocating. "What if we did something really special? 2 weeks in Bali, maybe 3. You could use the break from work." "That's a long time to be away from the agency," I said carefully, watching his face. "We have 3 major campaigns launching this summer." Brandon waved his hand dismissively. "You have a whole team for that. Lauren can handle things while you're gone. Besides," he pulled me closer, his voice dropping to something meant to sound intimate, "it might be good to step back a bit. Let your people prove they can manage without you hovering over every detail." The subtle dig at my management style, disguised as concern for my well-being, was nothing new. But now I recognized it as part of his larger strategy to diminish my connection to my own company, to make me doubt my necessity to the business I'd built. "I'll think about it," I said noncommittally, and was rewarded with a flash of irritation across his features before he masked it with understanding. "Of course, take your time." He stood abruptly, his phone buzzing in his pocket. "I need to take this call. Work stuff." He disappeared into what had been my guest bedroom but had gradually become his private office, the door clicking shut with finality. I sat alone on the couch, wine untouched, and made a decision. I couldn't wait for some perfect moment to confront Brandon or end this engagement. Every day I delayed was another day he embedded himself deeper into my life, another opportunity for his schemes to advance. I pulled out my phone and texted Catherine a single sentence that would set everything in motion. "I want to end this now. What do I need to do?" Her response came within minutes, a detailed plan that was both legally sound and emotionally strategic. We would schedule what Brandon believed was a routine meeting with Catherine to discuss wedding-related legal matters, trust documentation that I supposedly wanted to establish before the marriage. In reality, it would be the confrontation where I presented him with evidence of his scheme and terminated our engagement with witnesses present. The meeting was set for the following Thursday at Catherine's office, neutral territory where Brandon couldn't control the environment or the narrative. In the meantime, I had to maintain the facade for 4 more days, pretending everything was fine while internally preparing for the explosion I knew was coming. Those 4 days were among the longest of my life. I went through the motions of normalcy with mechanical precision. I attended a gallery opening with Brandon, where he introduced me to a developer friend who made pointed comments about the underutilized potential of historic properties in Hyde Park. I smiled through a dinner with my father, where Brandon and Richard discussed market trends and investment strategies while I was expected to simply listen appreciatively. I even helped Brandon pick out a new suit for our wedding, standing in the department store dressing room area while he modeled options and talked about how impressive we'd look in our wedding photos. Each interaction felt surreal, like watching actors perform a play where I alone knew the script was about to change entirely. I caught myself studying Brandon with anthropological detachment, noting the calculated charm he deployed with waitstaff and strangers, the way he positioned himself physically to appear protective while actually being controlling, the subtle ways he diminished my contributions in conversations while making it seem like supportive guidance. Lauren noticed something was wrong despite my efforts to appear normal. On Wednesday, the day before the scheduled confrontation, she appeared in my office doorway with coffee and a concerned expression. "You've been different this week," she said without preamble, setting the coffee on my desk and settling into the chair across from me. Distracted. Going through motions. What's happening? Lauren had been with me since the agency's first year, when it was just the two of us working out of a shared office space, cold calling potential clients and subsisting on instant ramen between paychecks. She'd earned her position as my second in command through loyalty, competence, and an ability to read situations that bordered on prescient. I closed my laptop and met her eyes. "If I told you I was ending my engagement to Brandon, what would you say?" Her response was immediate and fervent. "Thank God. I've been waiting for you to realize he's toxic since about month 3 of your relationship." The bluntness surprised a laugh out of me, the first genuine one in days. "You never said anything." "Because you seemed happy, and who am I to judge?" Lauren leaned forward, her expression serious. "But he's been getting worse lately. More controlling. I've noticed how he talks over you in meetings when he stops by the office. The way he dismisses your ideas or reframes them as if he thought of them first. And last week when he called asking about the agency's financial performance, claiming you'd asked him to check in? That crossed a line. This was news to me, and troubling." "What did you tell him?" "That he'd need written authorization from you to access any company information." Lauren's smile was grim. "He didn't like that answer. Got pretty aggressive about how he was going to be your husband and had a right to know about your business assets. I told him marriage doesn't grant automatic access to proprietary business information and ended the call." I felt a rush of gratitude for Lauren's professional boundaries and protective instincts. "There's more to the story," I said, and found myself telling her everything. The overheard phone call. The property assessment. The prenup that Brandon thought gave him access but actually locked him out. The meeting scheduled for tomorrow that would end everything. Lauren listened without interruption, her expression cycling through shock, anger, and finally a fierce satisfaction. "So tomorrow he finds out he's been outmaneuvered by the woman he thought was too naive to protect herself?" "Essentially." I rubbed my temples, feeling the tension that had been building for weeks. "I'm terrified, Lauren. Not of being alone or losing him, but of what comes after. The confrontation. His reaction. Having to tell people what happened." "You'll get through it," Lauren said with conviction. "And you won't be alone. Whatever you need, the whole team has your back. We're not just employees, Victoria. We're the family you chose, and we choose you too." Her words steadied something inside me, reminding me that Brandon's betrayal, while devastating, hadn't destroyed everything I'd built. My business, my friendships, my home, all of it remained intact because I'd been smart enough and strong enough to protect it. Thursday morning arrived with unseasonable heat, the kind of oppressive humidity that made Austin feel more like a sauna than a city. I dressed carefully in a charcoal suit that projected professional authority, paired with the pearl earrings that had been my grandmother's. Armor disguised as business attire. Brandon was cheerful over breakfast, chatting about a potential consulting contract and asking if I'd thought more about the Bali honeymoon. I made noncommittal responses while pushing scrambled eggs around my plate, my appetite non-existent. "Don't forget we have that meeting with my lawyer this afternoon," I reminded him as he prepared to leave. 2:00 at her office downtown. "Right, the trust documentation." Brandon kissed my forehead absently. "Seems like overkill, but if it makes you feel better about asset protection, I'm happy to go through the motions." The condescension in his tone, the implication that my concerns were frivolous and that he was humoring my paranoia, stoked the anger I'd been carefully banking. Soon he'd understand exactly how serious my asset protection measures had been. I spent the morning at my office, unable to focus on anything productive. Lauren had rearranged my schedule, pushing everything to the following week with vague explanations about personal matters. At 1:00, I left for Catherine's office, arriving 30 minutes early to review the plan one final time. Catherine's office occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower in downtown Austin, with conference rooms that overlooked the city and the Colorado River beyond. We met in her largest conference room, where she'd assembled not just herself but also a junior partner named Marcus Chen who specialized in fraud cases, and a court reporter who would document everything said during the meeting. "This might seem like overkill," Catherine acknowledged as we reviewed the evidence folders she'd prepared, "but I want there to be no question about what happens today. Brandon needs to understand that you have documentation, witnesses, and legal representation. It removes any ambiguity about the seriousness of the situation." At precisely 2:00, the receptionist called to announce Brandon's arrival. Catherine went to greet him personally, and I heard their voices in the hallway, Brandon's jovial and unsuspecting, before they entered the conference room. Brandon's expression when he saw the assembled group was almost comical, confusion flickering across his features before he masked it with polite interest. "This is quite the setup for a trust document review," he said, attempting humor. "Should I be worried?" "Please, have a seat, Mr. Cooper." Catherine gestured to the chair across from where I sat, flanked by the lawyers. "We have several matters to discuss, and I want to ensure everything is properly documented." Brandon sat slowly, his eyes moving between the court reporter's equipment and the folders stacked in front of Catherine. A wariness had entered his posture, the first hint that perhaps things weren't as he'd assumed. Catherine began formally, stating the date, time, and parties present for the record. Then she opened the first folder and slid a document across the table to Brandon. "Mr. Cooper, do you recognize this document?" Brandon picked it up, and I watched the blood drain from his face as he recognized the prenuptial agreement he'd signed weeks ago. "Sure, this is the property document Victoria and I signed. The asset management paperwork." "Actually," Catherine's voice was crisp and professional, "that's a comprehensive prenuptial agreement that explicitly protects all of Victoria's premarital assets from any claim by you, whether during the marriage or in the event of divorce. You'll note your signature here, and Victoria's here, both properly witnessed and notarized." Brandon's eyes scanned the document frantically, and I could see the moment he reached the sections that spelled out exactly what he'd actually signed. His face flushed red, then pale, then red again. "This isn't what you told me this was," he said, his voice rising as he looked at me accusingly. "You said this was joint ownership paperwork. You lied to me." "I presented you with a legal document and asked if you wanted to sign it," I replied, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "You chose to sign without reading it thoroughly. That's not fraud, that's negligence on your part. You manipulative bitch." Brandon half rose from his chair before Marcus stepped forward, a silent reminder that there were witnesses and that aggressive behavior would be documented. "Mr. Cooper, I strongly suggest you remain seated and civil," Catherine said coldly. "We're not finished." She opened another folder and began laying out documents. "Phone records showing your calls with Natalie Ross. Photographs of the property assessor you hired to evaluate Victoria's home. A copy of the LLC paperwork for NR Cooper Developments. Financial projections you'd prepared showing estimated sale price and profit distribution from selling Victoria's property. Each document landed on the table like an accusation, building an undeniable record of Brandon's scheme. His face cycled through emotions, denial, anger, calculation, and finally a desperate attempt at deflection. "This is all a misunderstanding," he tried, his voice taking on a pleading quality I'd never heard before. "Yes, I was talking to Natalie about investment opportunities, but that doesn't mean I was planning to sell Victoria's house without her consent. I was just exploring options for our future. Options that included filing the LLC paperwork before you even met Victoria." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Options that involved telling your business partner," and I quote from this recorded phone conversation, "that Victoria was too focused on her little marketing projects to notice what you were doing?" She pressed play on a recording device, and Brandon's voice filled the room, unmistakably his words, unmistakably damning. I watched him crumble, the confident facade finally breaking completely. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice hoarse. "Money to keep quiet?" "I don't have much, but I can figure something out." The offer was so predictable, so pathetically typical, that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "I don't want your money, Brandon." I leaned forward, making sure he met my eyes. "I want you out of my house by Sunday. I want the key you have to my home, to my office, to my car. I want you to sign this document stating you have no claim to any of my property or assets and that you will not contact me, my family, my friends, or my employees after today." Catherine slid yet another document across the table, this one a separation agreement that included a non-disparagement clause and penalties for violation. "And if I refuse?" Brandon's last grasp at control was transparent and desperate. "Then we file fraud charges," Catherine said simply. "Attempted theft by deception. We have more than enough evidence. The police report is already drafted, we're simply waiting to see if we need to file it. Your choice, Mr. Cooper. Sign the agreement, leave Victoria's life quietly, or face criminal prosecution." The silence stretched out, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning and the court reporter's steady typing. Brandon stared at the separation agreement, then at me, and whatever he saw in my face must have convinced him that I was absolutely serious. He signed with shaking hands, the motion jerky and graceless. When he finished, Catherine immediately collected the document, making copies before handing one to Brandon. "You have until Sunday at 6 p.m. to remove your belongings from Victoria's residence," Catherine stated. "She will not be present during this time. You will leave the key on the kitchen counter when you leave. Any items remaining after 6 p.m. will be considered abandoned property and disposed of accordingly. Do you understand?" Brandon nodded mutely, all his earlier bluster completely deflated. "Then we're done here." Catherine stood, effectively dismissing him. "Mr. Chen will see you out." After Brandon left, escorted by Marcus to ensure he actually departed the building, I remained seated, my hands gripped together so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the confrontation was draining away, leaving behind a trembling exhaustion. "You did well," Catherine said gently, sitting beside me. That took courage, confronting him with all the evidence. Many people would have just ended the engagement without explanation, let him wonder what went wrong. "I needed him to know that I knew," I said quietly. "That I wasn't the naive fool he thought I was. That underestimating me was his mistake, not my weakness." Catherine squeezed my shoulder in a rare gesture of personal warmth. "For what it's worth, I think you're going to be fine. Better than fine. You've protected everything you built, and now you can move forward without looking over your shoulder." But as I left her office and drove through Austin's rush-hour traffic toward a home that would feel empty and strange without Brandon's presence, despite the betrayal, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was an ending and a beginning simultaneously. The life I'd planned had evaporated, but perhaps that life had been built on foundations that were never solid to begin with. Lauren was waiting on my front porch when I arrived, 2 bottles of wine and a bag of takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant in her hands. "I figured you might need this," she said simply. We sat in my living room, the space I'd so carefully restored and nearly lost, and I told her everything about the confrontation. With each detail, with each sip of wine, I felt the weight lifting incrementally. This wasn't the ending of my story. It was simply the end of a chapter I'd never intended to write in the first place. Sunday evening at 6:15, I returned to my house to find Brandon's key on the counter exactly where he'd been instructed to leave it. His belongings were gone, leaving behind empty spaces in the closet and gaps on shelves. But the house was still mine, unequivocally and legally protected. I walked through each room, reclaiming the space, and felt something shift inside me. Not quite healing, but the beginning of it. The start of understanding that betrayal, while painful, had also been instructive. I'd learned I was stronger than I'd known, more capable of protecting myself than I'd believed, and absolutely unwilling to settle for a partnership that didn't honor who I truly was. The question now was what came next, and whether I had the courage to truly start over, not just in ending what was broken but in building something entirely new. The morning after Brandon left, I woke to silence so complete it felt almost aggressive. No sound of the coffee maker he always started too early. No shower running while he prepared for whatever meetings he claimed to have. Just the quiet hum of my house settling around me, reclaiming its rhythms without the intrusion of his presence. I should have felt relieved, victorious even. Instead, I felt hollowed out, as though the confrontation had burned through something essential inside me. I called into the office and told Lauren I needed a week, maybe 2. She didn't ask questions, simply told me to take whatever time I required and that the team would handle everything. For 3 days I barely left my bedroom. I ordered delivery, ignored my phone except for Lauren's daily check-in texts, and slept in fragments between long stretches of staring at the ceiling. It wasn't depression exactly, more like my mind and body had simply declared a mandatory shutdown after months of operating in crisis mode. On the 4th day, my father showed up unannounced. I heard his key in the lock, a key I'd given him years ago for emergencies and had never thought to revoke, and his footsteps moving through the downstairs rooms before climbing to where I sat in my bedroom still wearing pajamas at 2 in the afternoon. Richard Hayes stood in my doorway, his expensive suit somehow looking rumpled despite its tailoring, his expression a mixture of concern and something harder to define. "Your assistant called me. Said you've been unreachable for days." Lauren had no right to do that, I said flatly, though without real heat. I knew she'd only called him out of genuine worry. She was concerned. My father moved into the room, his gaze taking in the closed curtains, the empty takeout containers, the general disarray. "She said you ended your engagement to Brandon. That there was some kind of legal situation." The urge to tell him everything rose in my throat, to explain exactly how his precious future son-in-law had planned to defraud me of everything I owned, how my father's own comments about my inability to manage assets had been weaponized against me. But what would be the point? Richard Hayes had never truly believed in my capabilities. One more piece of evidence wouldn't change decades of casual dismissal. "It didn't work out," I said instead. "We wanted different things." My father sat on the edge of my bed, a liberty he hadn't taken since I was a child sick with flu. "Victoria, I'm not going to pretend I understand your choices. I still think you should have joined my firm instead of starting your own company. I still think this house is too much responsibility for one person to manage. But you're my daughter, and seeing you like this concerns me." The admission, coming from a man who rarely acknowledged vulnerability, cracked something in my careful composure. "He tried to steal from me," I heard myself say. "Brandon. He was working with his ex to force me to sell this house so they could profit from the development. He had it all planned out before he even proposed." Richard's face went through a complicated series of expressions before settling on something that looked like genuine anger. "He what?" So I told him. Not everything, but enough. The overheard phone call. The property assessment. The LLC partnership with Natalie Ross. My father listened without interruption, his jaw tightening with each new detail. "And the prenup I had him sign?" I finished. "It protected everything. He got nothing because legally he was never entitled to anything in the first place." "You outmaneuvered him," Richard said slowly, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard directed at me before. Something that might have been respect. "That was smart thinking, Victoria. Strategic. I learned from watching you, I replied, the words carrying more weight than I'd intended. You always said business was about protecting your assets and knowing when someone was trying to take advantage. I just never thought I'd need to apply those lessons to my personal life. My father stood, walked to the window, and opened the curtains I'd kept closed for days. Sunlight flooded the room, harsh and unforgiving. I made mistakes with you, he said, still facing the window. I pushed you toward what I thought success should look like instead of supporting the path you chose. And apparently, I gave that bastard ammunition to use against you by questioning your judgment. The acknowledgement, partial and imperfect as it was, still meant something. I'm not going to work for your firm, Dad. I need you to understand that. My company, my choices, they're mine. I need you to respect that even if you don't agree with it. He turned back to face me, and for the first time in years, I saw him clearly. Not as the omnipotent authority figure of my childhood, but as a man in his 60s who'd built an empire at the cost of truly knowing his daughter. I can try, he said finally. It won't come naturally. But I can try. After he left, with promises to call his lawyer friends to ensure Brandon couldn't cause any further trouble, I finally got out of bed. I showered, changed into actual clothes, and went downstairs to my kitchen. The house felt different now, not empty but peaceful. Mine in a way it hadn't been when Brandon's presence had slowly invaded each room. I spent the next week in deliberate isolation, not hiding but intentionally withdrawing to assess what I actually wanted. I'd spent so much energy protecting what I'd built that I hadn't stopped to question whether those things still served the life I wanted to live. The house was beautiful, but did I need this much space just for myself? The agency was successful, but was I still passionate about the work or just going through profitable motions? Lauren came by on day 8 of my self-imposed sabbatical, letting herself in with the spare key I'd given her. She found me in the backyard, sketching in a notebook I hadn't opened in years. When did you start drawing again? She asked, settling into the chair beside mine. About an hour ago, I admitted. I found this notebook while cleaning out the guest room, the one Brandon had taken over. It was full of architectural sketches from when I was renovating the house. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed the design process, not just the business of restoration but the creative problem-solving of it. Lauren looked at the sketch I'd been working on, a rough concept for a different kind of space entirely. What is this? I don't know yet. Maybe nothing. I set down my pencil. Or maybe the beginning of an idea about what comes next. Over the following days, the idea crystallized into something tangible. What if I used my experience renovating my own home, combined with my marketing expertise, to help other people reimagine their spaces? Not a traditional design firm or a marketing agency, but something hybrid. A consultancy that helped people tell their stories through their environments while also teaching them how to market those transformations if they chose to monetize them through vacation rentals or event spaces. It was ambitious and risky and completely different from anything I'd done before. It excited me in a way the marketing agency hadn't in years. I'd built Hayes Marketing Solutions out of necessity and determination, proving I could succeed on my own terms. But this new concept felt like something more, a business born from genuine passion rather than stubborn independence. I spent 2 weeks developing the concept, creating business plans and financial projections with the same meticulous attention I'd applied to protecting my assets from Brandon. Lauren became my sounding board, helping me identify potential challenges and opportunities. Catherine reviewed the legal structure, ensuring I was protected from the start. The decision to sell Hayes Marketing Solutions came more easily than I expected. The agency was valuable, profitable, and had attracted interest from larger firms before. But more importantly, I realized it had served its purpose. I'd proven myself, built something substantial, and now I was ready to do something different. Lauren was the first person I told about my intention to sell. We were in my office, reviewing quarterly numbers, when I simply said it aloud. I'm going to sell the company. To her credit, she didn't seem shocked. I wondered if you might, she said calmly. You've been different since the Brandon situation. More focused on what matters to you rather than what you think you should be doing. Would you want to buy it? I asked. The question surprised us both. I could finance it, structure it so you could pay over time. The company should belong to someone who loves it, and you've been essential to its success from the beginning. Lauren's eyes widened, then filled with tears. She rapidly blinked away. Are you serious? Completely. You know the clients, the team trusts you, and you have the vision to take it further than I could at this point. I'd stay on for 6 months to ensure a smooth transition, but then it would be yours. We shook hands on it that afternoon, beginning the legal and financial process that would transfer ownership of Hayes Marketing Solutions to Lauren Kim over the next 3 years. The decision felt right in a way few things had recently, not running away from what I'd built but entrusting it to someone who would honor it while making it their own. With the agency transition in motion, I turned my attention to the new venture. I decided to call it Restore Consulting, a name that captured both the physical renovation aspect and the emotional rebuilding that often came with reimagining one's space. The business plan was solid, the concept unique enough to attract attention, and I had enough capital from the agency's sale to launch properly. But I also knew I needed a fresh start geographically. Austin held too many memories now, too many reminders of the life I'd thought I was building with Brandon. Every restaurant had a story, every street corner a ghost of a moment that had turned out to be fiction. I needed space to become whoever I was going to be next. I considered several cities before settling on Denver. It had a thriving housing market with plenty of older homes ripe for thoughtful renovation. The culture valued both preservation and innovation. And importantly, I knew absolutely no one there, which meant no history to navigate, no assumptions to overcome, just clean possibility. The decision to sell my Hyde Park house was harder. This property represented everything I'd fought to protect, the tangible symbol of my independence and resilience. But I also recognized I was holding on for symbolic reasons rather than practical ones. The house deserved someone who would love it as a home, not a trophy of survival. I listed it in late September, and it sold within 3 days for significantly more than I'd paid 7 years ago. The buyers were a young family, a professor and an architect with 2 small children who gasped with delight when they saw the restored woodwork and original fixtures. Watching their faces as they explored each room, I felt the last strings of attachment loosen. This house had been mine, had sheltered me, had been worth protecting. But it was time for it to be someone else's beginning. I kept my vintage Mercedes, though. Some symbols were worth carrying forward. The move to Denver happened quickly once I committed to it. I rented a furnished apartment in the Rhino district while I searched for the right property to buy, something that could serve as both residence and showcase for my new business. Lauren flew out to help me settle in, bringing care packages from my team and making me promise to visit Austin regularly. You're not running away, she told me as we unpacked boxes in my temporary apartment. You're running towards something. There's a difference. I hoped she was right. The weeks that followed were a blur of establishing residency, networking with local real estate agents and contractors, and beginning to build the foundation for Restore Consulting. I attended industry meetups, introduced myself to preservation societies, and slowly started to weave myself into Denver's fabric. It was at one of these networking events, a fundraiser for affordable housing initiatives at the Denver Art Museum, that I met Gabriel Torres. I noticed him first because he was the only other person at the event actually studying the architectural photographs on display rather than networking. He stood in front of a series showing the transformation of a warehouse into community housing, his focus absolute. The before and afters don't tell the whole story, I said, moving to stand beside him. They never show the months of planning, the budget crises, the moments when you're certain the whole project will collapse. He turned to look at me, and I was struck by intelligent eyes behind simple glasses and a slight smile that suggested he was used to people underestimating him. You sound like you're speaking from experience. I own a consulting firm that helps people reimagine their spaces. I extended my hand. Victoria Hayes. Restore Consulting. Gabriel Torres. He shook my hand with a grip that was firm without being aggressive. I'm a project manager with Elevation Development. We focus on sustainable urban housing solutions. We fell into easy conversation about adaptive reuse, historical preservation, and the challenge of balancing authenticity with modern functionality. Gabriel had a way of listening that felt genuine, asking follow-up questions that indicated he actually cared about the answers rather than waiting for his turn to speak. When the event ended, he asked if I'd be interested in continuing the discussion over coffee. Something in his directness, the lack of performative charm or calculated interest, made me say yes. That coffee meeting turned into a 3-hour conversation at a place near my apartment, ranging from architecture to childhood, Denver's development challenges to our respective reasons for being in Colorado. Gabriel had grown up in New Mexico, studied civil engineering at Colorado State, and had a quiet passion for creating housing that served communities rather than just generating profit. I told him about my move from Austin, though I kept the details vague. A relationship that didn't work out, a desire for a fresh start. He didn't press for more, seeming to understand that some stories needed time before they could be fully told. Over the following weeks, Gabriel and I developed a friendship that felt effortless in its lack of agenda. We met for coffee or lunch, discussing projects and ideas without any romantic undertone. He introduced me to other people in Denver's development community, and I began to establish the professional network essential for my new business. It was Gabriel who mentioned, casually over sandwiches one afternoon, that his company was looking for a consultant to help with the community engagement aspect of a major renovation project. They were converting an old brewery into mixed-use housing and retail, and they needed someone to help future residents visualize and participate in the design process. "You should bid on it," he said. "It's exactly the kind of work you described wanting to do." I submitted a proposal that evening, putting everything I'd learned from years of marketing and months of planning into a presentation that showcased not just what I could do but why it mattered. The focus wasn't on selling a vision but on creating collaborative space for community input, using design as a tool for empowerment rather than imposition. 2 weeks later, I got the contract. It was Restore Consulting's first major project, and it came with a budget, timeline, and visibility that could establish my reputation in Denver's development community. More than that, it was work that mattered, that aligned with values I'd been articulating to myself throughout this rebuilding process. Gabriel and I would be working together on the project, him managing the construction timeline and budget while I handled the community design workshops and visualization materials. Our first planning meeting included 4 other team members, all of whom seemed cautiously optimistic about this newcomer to Denver's scene. I stood at the head of the conference table in Elevation Development's office, presenting my approach to the project, and felt something click into place. This was who I was supposed to become. Not just someone who survived betrayal, but someone who used that experience to build something meaningful and authentic. After the meeting, Gabriel walked me to my car. "You were impressive in there," he said. "Confident but not arrogant. Clear about your vision without being rigid. The team responded well to you." I appreciated his words more than he probably realized. These past months had been about reconstruction in every sense, and moments of external validation helped confirm I was on the right path. As autumn progressed into winter, my life in Denver began to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like an actual home. I found my favorite coffee shop, established a routine at a nearby gym, and even adopted a dog from a local rescue, a mutt named Copper who had been overlooked because of his age and unremarkable appearance. The brewery project consumed most of my working hours, but in the best possible way. I facilitated workshops where future residents could express preferences about shared spaces and amenities. I created visualization boards showing different design options and their implications. I worked with Gabriel's team to ensure that community input actually influenced final decisions rather than being performative consultation. Gabriel and I developed an easy professional partnership that gradually expanded into genuine friendship. He was steady where I tended toward intensity, pragmatic where I could be idealistic. He never pushed for details about my past, content to know me as I was now rather than who I'd been before. It was December when our relationship shifted from friendly to something with more potential. We were walking Copper through a park near my apartment after a long day on site at the brewery, discussing the project timeline and some challenges we'd encountered with one of the contractors. "Can I ask you something personal?" Gabriel said abruptly, stopping on the path. "You don't have to answer if you'd rather not." I braced myself, assuming he was finally going to ask about my move to Denver, the story I'd kept vague. "Okay. Why did you really leave Austin?" And before you give me the simplified version, I should tell you that I already know more than you might think. One of the contractors on the brewery project used to work in Texas. He mentioned your marketing agency, said it was a big deal when you sold it. So I'm curious about the real story, not because I'm nosy but because I care about you and want to understand. His honesty deserved the same in return. So I told him everything. Brandon, the scheme, the prenup, the confrontation, the decision to start over completely. Gabriel listened without judgment, his expression thoughtful as he processed the full scope of what I'd been through. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. That explains something I've wondered about. Why you're so careful about financial boundaries. Why you always pay your own way even when I offer to cover coffee. Why you never talk about relationships or dating. I built my entire life around protecting what's mine, I said. It's hard to let go of that vigilance even when the thread is gone. Gabriel nodded slowly. I understand that. But Victoria, not everyone is looking to take from you. Some people just want to build alongside you. His words stayed with me over the following weeks as we continued working together and spending time outside of work. Gabriel never pushed for more than I was comfortable giving, but he also made his interest clear in small, genuine ways. Remembering how I took my coffee. Asking about my day and actually listening to the answer. Celebrating small victories on the project with the same enthusiasm as major milestones. By the time the new year arrived, I found myself considering the possibility that maybe I was ready for something more than professional success and personal healing. Maybe I was ready to risk connection again, this time with someone who had proven himself trustworthy through consistent action rather than performative charm. The brewery conversion project reached completion in late March, and Elevation Development decided to host a celebration event showcasing the transformation. It would be part open house for future residents, part networking opportunity for the development community, and part fundraiser for affordable housing initiatives in Denver. Gabriel asked if I'd help organize it, and I agreed, recognizing it as an opportunity to demonstrate the full scope of what Restore Consulting could accomplish. The event planning consumed 3 weeks of intensive work. I coordinated with caterers who used local sustainable ingredients, arranged for a jazz quartet that had performed at the original brewery decades ago, and created presentation materials showing the before, during, and after stages of the renovation. Every detail was designed to tell the story of thoughtful transformation that honored history while creating something viable for the future. Gabriel and I worked closely throughout the planning, our professional collaboration continuing to deepen into something more personal. He'd started staying for dinner after our planning sessions, helping me cook while Copper supervised from his bed in the corner of my kitchen. We'd fallen into comfortable patterns, the kind that emerge between people who genuinely enjoy each other's company without needing constant entertainment or validation. One evening, about a week before the event, Gabriel looked up from the vegetables he was chopping and asked a question that had clearly been building for a while. Have you thought about what happens after the brewery project? With us, I mean. I set down the spoon I'd been using to stir sauce, giving his question the consideration it deserved. Honestly, I've been afraid to think too far ahead. Everything with Brandon taught me that plans can be illusions, that people aren't always who they present themselves to be. I'm not Brandon, Gabriel said quietly. I know you need to trust that on your own timeline, but I want you to know that I see you, Victoria. Not your house or your business or your assets. You. The person who spends 3 hours perfecting a community workshop because she genuinely cares about giving people voice in their environments. The woman who rescued a senior dog nobody else wanted because she saw value others missed. That's who I'm interested in. His words landed with unexpected weight, not because they were elaborate or rehearsed but because they were specific and observant. Gabriel had been paying attention to who I actually was rather than constructing a fantasy based on what I could provide him. I'm not ready for anything serious yet, I said honestly. But I'd like to see where this goes, if you're willing to be patient with my caution. Gabriel smiled, returning to his chopping. I can work with that. Besides, I'm in this for the long term, not the quick win. That's sort of my approach to everything, if you hadn't noticed. The night of the brewery event arrived with perfect spring weather, warm enough to open the renovated courtyard space but cool enough that the industrial heating system could showcase its efficiency. Guests began arriving at 6, a mixture of future residents, city officials, development professionals, and media representatives interested in the project's community-centered approach. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a deep burgundy dress that projected professionalism while remaining approachable, paired with comfortable heels that could withstand hours of standing and circulating. Gabriel wore a suit I'd never seen before, tailored in a way that suggested he'd taken the evening as seriously as I had. We positioned ourselves near the entrance, greeting arrivals and directing them toward different areas of the space. The presentations I'd created played on screens throughout the building, showing resident input sessions and how those conversations had influenced final design decisions. Former brewery workers who'd participated in oral history interviews mingled with new residents, creating living bridges between the building's past and future. The evening was progressing beautifully, everything unfolding according to plan, when Gabriel touched my elbow and nodded toward the entrance. "I think you need to see this." I turned to follow his gaze and felt my stomach drop. Brandon had just walked through the door, Natalie Ross beside him. They were dressed expensively, projecting confidence that seemed out of place given the last time I'd seen Brandon. He'd been signing documents that dissolved our engagement and barred him from contacting me. "What are they doing here?" I asked Gabriel, keeping my voice low despite the shock coursing through me. "I have no idea, but we're about to find out." Gabriel moved slightly closer, a subtle gesture of support and protection. "Do you want me to have security remove them?" The question made me realize that Gabriel didn't just believe my story about Brandon, he was prepared to act on that belief without hesitation. But removing them would create a scene, draw attention I didn't want on what should be a celebration of the project's success. "Not yet," I decided. "Let's see what they want first." Brandon spotted me and began moving through the crowd with Natalie in tow. Up close, I could see that things hadn't gone well for them in the months since I'd left Austin. Brandon's suit was good quality but showed signs of wear, and there was a tightness around his eyes that suggested stress or financial pressure. Natalie looked polished but harder somehow, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Victoria," Brandon said, his tone attempting warmth that rang false. "I heard about this project and wanted to see what you've been working on. Impressive turnout." "You need to leave," I said directly, seeing no point in pretending this was a pleasant social encounter. "The separation agreement you signed included a no-contact provision. You're violating that by being here." "This is a public event," Natalie interjected, her lawyer training evident in her precise diction. "Brandon has every right to attend as a member of the development community." "He has no rights where I'm concerned," I replied, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "And you both know exactly what you're doing showing up here." Gabriel had moved to stand beside me, his presence reassuring without being aggressive. "I'm going to have to ask you both to leave. This is a private event hosted by Elevation Development, and you're making one of our key consultants uncomfortable." Brandon's expression shifted from false friendliness to something uglier. "Key consultant? That's generous. We're in the same professional circles now, Victoria. You can't avoid me forever just because your engagement didn't work out." The casual reframing of events, reducing his fraud and betrayal to simply an engagement that didn't work out, sparked anger that burned through my initial shock. "You tried to steal my house," I said clearly, not caring if nearby guests could hear. "You schemed with your business partner to manipulate me into marriage so you could force a sale and profit from my property. The only reason you failed is because I discovered your plan and protected myself legally." "That's a dramatic interpretation of a business discussion," Natalie said smoothly, though her eyes had hardened. "Perhaps if you'd been more open to communication about financial planning, there wouldn't have been misunderstandings." The gaslighting attempt was so transparent, so perfectly in character for both of them, that I almost laughed. Gabriel, however, had reached the end of his patience. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call while keeping his eyes on Brandon and Natalie. "Security is on their way," he informed them. "You can leave voluntarily now, or you can be escorted out and banned from all future Elevation Development events. Your choice." Brandon's face flushed red, and for a moment I thought he might cause a scene. But Natalie put her hand on his arm, her calculation clearly determining that making a spectacle would cost them more than leaving quietly. "This isn't over," Brandon said as they turned to go. We're part of the Denver development scene now. You're going to have to get used to seeing us around. After they left, Gabriel stayed close while I took several deep breaths to steady myself. Other guests had noticed the tension but seemed uncertain about what they'd witnessed. I needed to recover my composure and refocus on the event's purpose. I'm okay, I told Gabriel, grateful for his concerned expression but needing to prove to myself that I could handle this. Let's get back to celebrating the project. The rest of the evening passed without incident, though I couldn't fully shake the unease of Brandon's appearance. Why had he and Natalie come to Denver? Were they actually working in development here, or had they tracked me down specifically? And what did Brandon mean when he said this wasn't over? After the last guests departed and the catering team had finished cleanup, Gabriel and I sat in the renovated courtyard with glasses of wine left over from the event. The space was beautiful in the evening light, industrial elements softened by strategic landscaping and warm lighting. Do you want to talk about what happened earlier? Gabriel asked gently. I don't know what to say. I thought that chapter was closed, that I'd moved far enough away to escape the complications of my old life. And yet here they are, inserting themselves back into my world. Gabriel was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. When you told me about Brandon, about what he did, I wondered if you were running away or running towards something. Tonight made me realize it was both, and maybe that's okay. You ran from a bad situation and toward building something better. But that doesn't mean the past won't occasionally catch up. His insight was uncomfortable in its accuracy. I had been running, even if I'd framed it as a strategic fresh start. And perhaps some part of me had hoped that physical distance would provide permanent emotional insulation from the damage Brandon had caused. What do I do if they keep showing up? I asked, voicing the fear that had been building since the moment I saw them walk through the door. Do I let them contaminate my new life? Do I shrink from opportunities because they might be there? You do what you've been doing, Gabriel said firmly. You build your business, create meaningful work, and refuse to let their presence dictate your choices. And, he added with a slight smile, you let people who care about you help carry some of that weight. You don't have to face everything alone anymore. 2 days after the brewery event, I received a formal letter from Natalie's law firm. It informed me that Brandon was considering legal action against me for defamation based on statements I'd allegedly made about him at the event. The letter suggested that a financial settlement might resolve the matter without costly litigation. The transparent attempt at extortion made me furious. I immediately called Catherine Wong in Austin, who'd remained my attorney even after my move to Colorado. She listened to my recounting of the brewery confrontation and the letter's contents before responding with barely contained anger. This is harassment, pure and simple. They're trying to intimidate you into paying them to go away. We're going to respond very directly. Catherine's return letter, copied to me before being sent, was a masterpiece of legal threat. It detailed Brandon's fraudulent scheme, referenced the signed separation agreement that included his admission of wrongdoing, and promised that any lawsuit he filed would be met with immediate countersuit for harassment and breach of contract. Furthermore, it noted that I had witnesses to the brewery confrontation, including Gabriel and several other attendees who could testify that I'd simply stated facts about Brandon's documented behavior. The letter concluded with a warning that any further contact from Brandon or anyone acting on his behalf would result in immediate legal action and potentially criminal harassment charges. I never heard from Natalie's firm again. Brandon and Natalie's attempt to intimidate me had backfired, making it clear that I wasn't the naive target they'd once known but someone fully prepared to defend herself legally. In the weeks that followed, Restore Consulting gained significant attention from the brewery project's success. I was invited to bid on 2 additional renovation consultations, both for historic properties being converted to mixed use. The Denver Post ran a feature about community-centered development that prominently featured my work. Invitations to speak on panels and participate in professional organizations multiplied. My business was thriving, my reputation growing, and I felt more confident in my professional identity than ever before. But the personal side remained complicated. Gabriel and I continued growing closer, our relationship deepening through consistent small gestures and genuine compatibility. Yet I couldn't quite shake the wariness that Brandon's reappearance had reinforced. It was Lauren who finally called me out on my hesitation during one of her visits to Denver. We were having dinner at a restaurant Gabriel had recommended, and I'd spent 20 minutes explaining why I wasn't ready to commit to attending a family wedding with him despite the fact that we'd been dating, officially if cautiously, for 3 months. "You're protecting yourself right into loneliness," Lauren said bluntly. "I understand being careful after what Brandon did, but Gabriel isn't Brandon. He's proven himself over and over. At some point, you have to decide whether you're going to let past betrayal define your future relationships." "What if I'm wrong about him?" I asked, voicing the fear that kept me from fully opening up. "What if I'm missing red flags again?" "Then you deal with it when it happens," Lauren replied. "But Victoria, you can't go through life assuming everyone will hurt you. That's not protection, that's prison. And you didn't survive Brandon's scheme just to lock yourself away from genuine connection." Her words forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. I'd become so focused on protecting my assets and independence that I'd started protecting myself from vulnerability entirely. Safety had become isolation, and that wasn't the life I actually wanted to build. That night, I called Gabriel and asked if he wanted to come over. When he arrived, I met him at the door with an honesty I'd been withholding. "I've been holding back," I said without preamble. "Not because of anything you've done but because I'm terrified of being wrong about someone again. But that's not fair to you, and it's not fair to myself either. So I need you to know that I'm ready to stop being so guarded. If you're still interested in seeing where this goes, I'm willing to actually try instead of keeping one foot out the door." Gabriel pulled me into a hug that felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. "I'm interested," he said against my hair. "I've been interested since that first conversation at the museum. I'm willing to go at whatever pace you need, but I'm glad you're ready to actually be present instead of constantly preparing for escape." As spring turned to summer, my life in Denver solidified into something real and sustainable. Restore Consulting continued growing, with 3 active projects and a waiting list of potential clients. I hired my first employee, a recent architecture graduate named Sophie who had exactly the kind of community-focused passion the business needed. My relationship with Gabriel evolved from cautious dating to genuine partnership, built on mutual respect and actual compatibility rather than performance and manipulation. In June, I received an unexpected email from an event coordinator in Austin. A major development conference was being held there in September, and they wanted me to be one of the keynote speakers about community-centered renovation approaches. The invitation was flattering and professionally significant, but it also meant returning to the city I'd fled, facing the memories and possibly the people I'd left behind. I showed the email to Gabriel over breakfast, uncertain about my reaction. "This is huge for your business," he said after reading it. "National exposure, positioning you as a thought leader. You have to accept." I know I should, but the thought of going back to Austin makes me anxious. What if Brandon shows up? What if my father expects some kind of reconciliation dinner? What if seeing all those familiar places makes me question the life I've built here? Gabriel set down his coffee and took my hand across the table. "Then I'll come with you. Not to hover or protect you, but to be there as a reminder that your life now is real and solid. You're not the person who left Austin broken and betrayed. You're someone who rebuilt herself completely. Going back might actually be the final step in proving that to yourself." His offer, made without expectation or demand, crystallized my decision. I accepted the speaking invitation and booked flights for both Gabriel and myself. Whatever awaited me in Austin, I would face it not as someone running away or hiding, but as someone confident enough in what she'd built to return without fear. The weeks leading up to the conference were busy with preparation. I refined my presentation, focusing on the brewery project and 2 others I'd completed since moving to Denver. Sophie managed our ongoing projects with competence that validated my hiring decision. And Gabriel made quiet arrangements, booking us a hotel room and researching restaurants we could try, treating the trip as an opportunity rather than an ordeal. 2 days before we were scheduled to fly to Austin, I received a phone call from my father. His tone was formal but carried an undercurrent of something that might have been pride. "I saw you're speaking at the Southwest Development Conference," he said. "I wanted you to know that I plan to attend your session. If you're comfortable with that." The question, asked rather than assumed, represented growth in our relationship. Of course, Dad. I'd be glad to have you there. There was a pause before he continued. I've been following your work, Victoria. The articles in industry publications, the projects you've completed in Denver. You've built something impressive, and you did it on your own terms. I wanted you to know that I see that now. The acknowledgement, coming from a man who'd spent most of my life questioning my choices, meant more than he probably realized. Thank you, I said simply. That means a lot. As I hung up the phone, I realized that returning to Austin wasn't just about facing Brandon or proving my success to people who doubted me. It was about completing a circle, demonstrating to myself and everyone who'd known me before that I hadn't just survived betrayal but had transformed it into fuel for becoming someone stronger and more authentic. Gabriel found me sitting thoughtfully by the window, Kappa's head resting on my lap. You okay? He asked. Better than okay, I replied, surprising myself with the truth of it. I'm ready. Ready to go back, ready to speak about my work, ready to face whatever comes. Because none of it can touch what I've built here, what I've become. He smiled and settled beside me, and in that moment I understood that this was what genuine partnership felt like. Not someone trying to control or diminish me, but someone willing to stand beside me while I faced my own challenges on my own terms. The betrayal I'd experienced had taught me to protect myself, but the healing I'd done since had taught me something more valuable: how to remain open to connection while maintaining boundaries, how to trust again without being naive. Austin awaited, with all its complicated history and potential confrontations. But I was no longer the woman who'd fled in the night with everything she could carry. I was someone who'd rebuilt deliberately and well, and I was finally ready to prove it. The conference center in Austin felt both familiar and foreign as Gabriel and I walked through its entrance on the morning of my keynote presentation. The September heat hadn't diminished since I'd left, that particular Texas humidity that made the air feel thick and substantial. I'd chosen a slate gray suit that projected authority without aggression, my presentation materials organized in the leather portfolio Catherine had given me as a congratulatory gift when Restore Consulting landed its 5th major client. Gabriel squeezed my hand briefly before we separated, him heading to the general seating area while I made my way backstage to the speaker preparation room. My session was scheduled for 11, giving me an hour to review my notes and manage the nervous energy that always preceded public speaking. The presentation room filled quickly, attendance apparently strong for a session on community-centered development. I stood in the wings, watching people settle into seats, and spotted my father in the 3rd row, his presence exactly where he'd promised it would be. Lauren had flown in as well, sitting beside Gabriel near the back, her supportive smile visible even from a distance. Then I saw them. Brandon and Natalie, positioned deliberately in the center section where I couldn't avoid seeing them during my talk. Brandon's expression carried a smugness that suggested he thought his presence would rattle me, would undermine my confidence and validate his long-held belief that I wasn't capable of handling pressure. The conference moderator introduced me with a bio that highlighted my successful projects and innovative approach to renovation consulting. I walked onto the stage, connected my laptop to the projection system, and looked out at the audience with complete clarity about what this moment represented. Good morning. My name is Victoria Hayes, and I'm here to talk about what happens when we stop treating buildings as mere assets and start seeing them as community anchors with stories worth honoring. I launched into my presentation, detailing the brewery conversion with specific examples of how resident input had shaped final design decisions. I showed before and after images, but more importantly, I showed the process, the community workshops, the feedback sessions, the iterations that came from actually listening to people who would live in and use the spaces we were creating. Brandon's presence faded into irrelevance as I found my rhythm, speaking with genuine passion about work that mattered to me. I discussed challenges we'd faced, mistakes we'd corrected, and lessons we'd learned about balancing preservation with innovation. The audience was engaged, taking notes, nodding at points that resonated. During the question and answer period, hands shot up immediately. I fielded inquiries about budget management, contractor relationships, and scalability of the community input model. Then a hand rose in Brandon's row, and I felt Gabriel tense in the back even as I maintained my composure. Yes, the gentleman in the blue shirt, I acknowledged, refusing to show any recognition beyond standard professionalism. Brandon stood, his voice carrying false congeniality. This all sounds very idealistic, but how do you balance community sentiment with financial realities? Sometimes the best economic decision requires making tough choices that not everyone will support. The question was clearly designed to position me as naive, to suggest my approach was impractical dreaming rather than viable business strategy. I smiled, recognizing the trap and prepared to step around it entirely. That's an excellent question, and one that reveals a fundamental misunderstanding about what drives sustainable development. Community input isn't opposed to financial success, it's essential to it. Properties that reflect and serve their communities maintain higher occupancy rates, command premium pricing, and generate long-term value that exceeds short-term extraction strategies. I paused, meeting his eyes directly. The numbers prove that respecting people isn't just ethical, it's profitable. The audience murmured approval, several people nodding emphatically. Brandon sat down, his attempt to undermine me having backfired entirely. After the session ended, I was surrounded by attendees wanting to discuss potential collaborations, ask follow-up questions, or simply express appreciation for the presentation. My father waited patiently until the crowd thinned before approaching. "You were exceptional," he said simply. "I've attended hundreds of these conferences over the years, and that was one of the most compelling presentations I've witnessed." "Thanks, Dad." His praise felt genuine rather than obligatory, and I accepted it without the defensive skepticism that once would have been automatic. "I was wrong about your choices," Richard continued. "I see that now. You didn't need to follow my path because you were capable of creating your own. I'm sorry it took me this long to recognize that." Gabriel materialized beside me as other attendees continued approaching. He shook my father's hand, introduced himself naturally, and I watched Richard assess him with the practiced eye of someone used to evaluating people quickly. Whatever he saw must have passed muster because his expression softened into something approaching approval. Lauren joined us moments later, and we formed a small protective circle as Brandon and Natalie attempted to approach. Gabriel stepped forward slightly, his body language making it clear they weren't welcome. "I think you've done enough," Gabriel said quietly but firmly. "Victoria gave her presentation, answered your question professionally, and has no interest in further interaction." Brandon's face reddened, but Natalie pulled him away, clearly recognizing they'd already lost whatever game they'd attempted to play. I watched them leave and felt nothing, no anger, no satisfaction, just complete indifference to their presence in my life. The rest of the conference passed in a blur of networking and conversations about potential projects. Several firms expressed interest in consulting services similar to what I described. By the time Gabriel and I returned to our hotel that evening, I had 6 solid business leads and invitations to speak at 2 additional conferences. We sat on the hotel balcony overlooking downtown Austin, the city lights spreading out below us like scattered stars. "So," Gabriel said, handing me a glass of wine, "how does it feel to face your past and win?" I considered his question seriously. "It doesn't feel like winning, actually. It feels like closure. Like proving to myself that Brandon's betrayal wasn't the end of my story, just an unexpected chapter that taught me things I needed to learn." "And what did you learn?" Gabriel asked. "That protecting myself doesn't mean isolating myself. That being cautious isn't the same as being closed. And that the right partnership, whether in business or life, should make both people stronger rather than diminishing one to elevate the other." Gabriel raised his glass in a toast. "To partnerships that lift both people higher." As we clinked glasses, I looked out over Austin and felt the final pieces of unresolved hurt settle into place. This city had been my home once, had witnessed both my naivety and my awakening. But Denver was where I'd chosen to build deliberately, and that choice had made all the difference. The next morning, as we prepared to fly back to Colorado, my phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. The message was brief but significant. "Brandon filed for bankruptcy yesterday. His development schemes finally caught up with him. Thought you'd want to know." I showed Gabriel the message, and he raised an eyebrow. "How do you feel about that?" "Relieved that I protected myself when I did. Grateful that his failures are his own and not mine. And ready to go home." We boarded the plane back to Denver, back to the life I'd constructed with intention and care, back to work that mattered and relationships built on honesty. Brandon had tried to steal my foundation, but in defending it, I discovered I was capable of building something far more substantial than even I had imagined. The woman who landed in Denver that afternoon was different from the one who'd fled Austin years ago. She knew her worth, protected her boundaries, and remained open to authentic connection. She'd learned that the best revenge wasn't proving something to people who'd underestimated her, it was building a life so genuine and fulfilling that their opinions became irrelevant. Copper greeted us at the door of my loft, tail wagging with uncomplicated joy. Gabriel helped me unpack while discussing the leads from the conference and which ones seemed most promising. And in that ordinary moment, surrounded by the life I'd chosen and the person who'd proven himself worthy of trust, I understood that I'd finally arrived exactly where I was meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.